I'm delighted today to introduce you, if you don't already know them, to Ricardo Lara, who's the Insurance Commissioner of the California Department of Insurance, and Maura Gill, who's Associate Vice President of Government and Industry Relations at TD Insurance, also the Board Vice Chair of the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, which the UN convenes. Just to kick off, so for a bit of background, for those who don't know, UNEP hosts the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and it now has around 140 members, which represents about 1/3 of world premium. So this is really to shift the insurance industry to address sustainability issues and really integrate it into mainstream business. But it's, these 140 signatories, they're at different stages of the journey, and the PSI signatories in Canada have really been amongst the most proactive in the world. And they formed a task force to develop an action plan which looks at how Canada's insurance industry can really help contribute to a sustainable and resilient Canadian economy. And this is through their role as risk managers, insurers, and investors. This builds on recommendations from Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance, which is really looking at how to spur market activities, behaviors, and structures needed to bring sustainable finance into the mainstream. And this is, of course, to secure a sustainable economy for society. Now, the PSI and the Insurance Commissioner, Ricardo Lara, also launched the first of its kind California Sustainable Insurance Roadmap, also last year. And this is really a roadmap that helps to shift strategically the insurance's role in combating climate change for California's residents and businesses. This is really looking at how the insurance industry can really proactively contribute to reducing emissions and increasing the community's resilience while better supporting recovery from climate-related disasters. Now, most sustainable finance roadmaps around the world have been predominantly, if not exclusively, focused more on investment and lending, not insurance. But if they do refer to the insurance industry, often it's focusing on the insurance industry's role as investors and not as risk managers, where they bring risk reduction measures, and not as risk carriers, where they provide insurance solutions. So if they do cite insurance, often it's also largely around their role in enhancing adaptation and resilience, and doesn't really always address the role of how they can play a role in addressing negative externalities, such as greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. So to cut it short, the common denominator across the California Sustainable Insurance Roadmap and the work of the PSI, Canadian Sustainable Insurance Task Force, and other PSI-supported roadmaps is really to take into account the triple role of the insurance industry as risk managers, insurers, and investors in driving sustainability, so spanning both adaptation, resilience, and the net zero transition, and nature, social issues, and the ESG spectrum. So let's first go to California. Commissioner Lara, please tell us about California's insurance roadmap.
Well, I'm going to show you instead of tell you.
Even better.
It's great to be here. Buenas tardes. It's a pleasure. Greetings from California, where it's never boring. And we have so much to talk about when it comes to different perils that we unfortunately face. And so what you'll see today is really a work of several years with the UNPSI, and this is actually the first time that we get to unveil the roadmap, because when we had a conversation back in Zurich, it was still embargoed. So it's my pleasure to really unveil our comprehensive roadmap that we've been working so long for. And so, again, this is really the culmination of so many years of work with UNPSI. And I will describe the roadmap, the goals, the strategies, and our actions, and we'll highlight some of our accomplishments, and we'll also do some horizon scanning on the point out some of our next steps as we see ahead. And really look forward to hearing and having the discussion with my good friend Moira, who we've already talked about all this stuff all day today. And so our sustainable roadmap really represents the first time in California, and indeed the first time that any U.S. state has laid out a strategic vision for the insurance sector to address climate change. And as we combat the impacts of climate change, this roadmap outlines the strategies and actions we will take to protect consumers and to create a more sustainable insurance market in California, which California represents the largest insurance market in the US, fourth in the world. So we have no choice but to get it right. And so as you can see in our scheme, as California Insurance Commissioner, you all met Commissioner Bahrain. She is appointed by her governor. In California, I am elected by the voters of California. There is 12 of us insurance commissioners that are elected. The appointed insurance commissioners call us the dirty dozen. And so my top priority is to protect Californians, to protect consumers. In the context of climate change, we need to really rethink the products, the investments, and the risk reduction strategies that will protect us all from climate hazards. And we've built our roadmap around really 4 essential goals with associated strategies and actions. And really our 4 goals are to reduce emissions, as we've heard over and over again. That's how we're going to get to our goals. Close the protection gap between insured and uninsured losses for vulnerable individuals and communities. Keep insurance available and affordable, and of course, investing in nature to protect our communities. And to achieve these 4 goals, we have 4 primary strategies. 1, really strengthen transparency and financial oversight. We've already made an important shift in the US, as you heard by Commissioner Bahrain earlier this morning, around adopting our TCFD climate risk disclosure. And one of the next step is really for us in California and in the US is to build capacity for implementing and communicating scenario analysis, and then develop best practices around those. Second, we will promote the transition to sustainable investment strategies. So what does that mean? We've already taken some first steps in California by conducting the most exhaustive analysis of insurance company investments in fossil fuels, but also in green bonds and investments in renewable energy, clean transportation, and nature-based solutions. Third, we really want to catalyze sustainable insurance products. Our first step was to create the first ever database of climate-smart products, providing really a resource for finding insurance policies for zero-emission truck and buses is a priority for us in California. Last fall, we completed our first in the nation regulations to require insurance companies to actually provide consumers with discounts for home hardening and community hardening in residential and commercial insurance policies against wildfires. We feel that we need to work together to bring down the risk. This is how we keep insurance affordable and available for everyone. And the way we do that is by incentivizing through discounts, having consumers actually be able to do the home hardening themselves. And fourth, we want to really create resilient communities by encouraging investment in nature-based solutions and community risk reduction, and healthy ecosystems can provide protection against climate risks. But in order to scale, progress needs to be made at the community level. And this is why I'm sponsoring legislation to allow the creation of, I sponsored, I should say, the creation of climate resiliency districts, which allow communities to be able to raise their own taxes, to be able to create these resiliency districts, and that go directly to protecting and restoring nature-based solutions. We've also sponsored legislation to create the first ever extreme heat ranking system, and both of those bills were signed in September. So as we move on and looking at risk, so what does this roadmap mean for what does it mean for actual people, right? We could sit in this room and talk about it amongst ourselves, but we need to figure out how we have these conversations with average, everyday folks, and what does this mean for their lives? So it means that governments can do a better job about assessing and communicating risk. We can provide better early warning systems to communicate risk more clearly to our communities. And we can educate people about the values of insurance in building resiliency and climate risk. And for individuals and communities, it really means understanding risk and working to reduce those risks so that there are fewer losses when future disasters occur. Risk reduction, again, remains critical in improving insurance availability and affordability. And for insurance companies, it means tailoring their investments towards climate solutions, as well as writing products that we will need for zero-emission technologies and products that would benefit the entire community. Earlier, we mentioned that we strengthened and championed climate-related financial disclosures, and we took an important first step, as Commissioner Borain said. In the U.S., unlike many other countries, the states regulate insurance, and we coordinate closely through the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. In some parts of the U.S., as we hear time and time again, climate change is a very politically contentious issue. Not in California, I'm here to report. But we have worked hard with the NAIC to build a bipartisan coalition of U.S. regulators to implement TCFD disclosures. Last April, NAIC adopted the TCFD Aligned Survey, and we are now analyzing and assessing the results of that survey. We've also made tremendous progress on climate risk disclosures. In 2018, we received 0 TCFD reports from U.S. insurers. This year, we are reporting now over 80% of the market will be reporting. That demonstrates the importance of U.S. regulators working together to implement what has been the international standard, as we know. And we are growing our coalition by working with other state regulators. Just to give you a quick example, in 2018, we had 6 states implementing a climate risk disclosure survey. We now have 26 states participating, representing over 80% of the market. These disclosures enhance, as we know, transparency about how insurance companies manage their climate-related risks and also opportunities, and prompt companies to look more seriously at both climate risk and climate solutions. So as we transition to sustainable strategies, as governments and markets grapple with the impacts of climate change, carbon-intensive industries could become stranded assets, as we know, affecting insurers that hold those investments. So our department has been working to analyze investments for fossil fuel exposure and also for green exposure aligned with emerging standards. Last year, we issued a climate investment report that identifies insurance companies' investments in tar sands, coal, and oil and gas, as well as investments in utilities that produce energy from fossil fuels. We also analyzed investments in green bonds for the first time to examine how insurance companies were approaching investments that could reduce future climate risks. And this climate investment report provides investment information to consumers to use in decisions over where their premiums go, which we feel is very important, letting them support climate action through their insurance choices. So in addition, we are taking several steps to expand climate-friendly financing opportunities, including joining the California Green Bond Market Development Committee and exploring nature-based solutions, which we feel are very important. Moving forward, we have a partnership with the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, to really develop a multi-scenario analysis on insurance company investments that will help us understand the overall position of the California insurance markets when it comes to physical and transitional risk. The scenario and work produced through the network of greening in the financial sector has really been a benefit for our own capacity building in this space. So innovative insurance strategies we know can bolster climate response by offering creative new insurance products and by expanding public-private partnership opportunities that were also discussed throughout the day. And we need to think about what insurance products we will help build that will help build resilience. And in California, we have goals for deploying zero-emission trucks and buses, expanding our renewable energy, and of course, protecting nature. Insurance can support those goals by offering insurance policies for these emerging technologies and risks. And so we start by developing the first ever climate-smart database for insurance products, which we announced with the UNPSI back in 2020. This is leading to new partnerships and research to expand insurance options for new technologies and for nature. So now my department is collaborating with experts from environmental groups, universities, community-based organizations, local organizations, our tribal leaders, and insurance companies really to catalyze innovative approaches to insurance that will increase uptake and improve resilience to climate change at a community scale. This year, I'm sponsoring legislation to create a grant program for the first time in the department's history that would fund insurance demonstration projects to protect our most vulnerable communities, including our low-income homeowners and small business owners and renters who can least afford insurance and have the most to lose after a disaster. These insurance mechanisms would reduce and transfer risk, climate risk, for some of the biggest perils that you've seen already that we're facing and the rest of the world is flooding, sea level rise, extreme heat, drought, and wildfire, and the compounding effects of all of them on communities. And there are community scale nature-first solutions that prioritize natural protections. Streets and roads can be dangerously flooded, as we saw just last month in Southern California. Bridges can crack and cables can melt in the heat, but nature doesn't need a power plug to protect us. The bill that creates these 6 pilot projects in areas especially at risk from climate change are all the way from the Bay Area down to the border with Mexico. Inland communities are subject to extreme heat. We talk about Coachella Valley, the city of San Fernando, the Pala Band of Mission Indians land, and we would develop innovative approaches to reduce heat impacts, for example, investing in business interruption insurance for outdoor agricultural workers, supporting the greening of their communities, or financing neighborhood heat relief. These are all innovative projects that we're looking at to fund this year. So in the next slide, we look really as nature as an ally in our fight for climate change. Healthy forests, wetlands, dunes, rivers, and other ecosystems can buffer the effects of climate threats and sequester carbon, as we all know. Insurance policies should encourage communities to turn to cost-effective, nature-based approaches that have many social and, of course, ecological benefits instead of carbon-intensive infrastructure that we all know depreciates over time and is much more costly. So when we invest in risk reduction, nature-based solutions really should be at the core. For instance, our coastal wetlands are natural buffers, protecting lives and insurance losses, of course. And I see a future insurance policy on a community level that would help cover people's losses if they were flooding and help protect and restore the wetlands and use them as a natural buffer. So working with the UN, we have discussed some examples around the world, and I think these approaches could protect Californians, again, from atmospheric rivers and flooding, as we see on the west side, the west coast of Canada as well. And so we also need to ensure reduce the risk for the entire community. By combining community-based insurance approaches and nature-based solutions, communities can really bring down their risk while also reducing the protection gap. Communities and individuals can take steps to reduce their risk, like community early warning systems or home hardening measures. In October, I finalized the new wildfire mitigation regulation, really establishing the first wildfire mitigation regulation in the United States that incentivizes risk reduction. Insurance needs to drive risk reduction, not just the pricing. And insurance regulators are in the perfect position to communicate to the public what mitigation actions are best. And so in 2018, for example, only 7% of Californians had access to home hardening incentives. With our wildfire regulation effect, these incentives are now available to every single Californian. So providing a strong mechanism for communities to reduce their wildfire risk, but also giving them the discounts that they need to be able to pay for those home hardening methodologies that are very costly. And also we incentivize Californians to do the right thing because they're getting the discounts to do it. And this is how we are working to bring down the risk for everyone. Once you bring down the risk, you keep insurers in the community, you keep them writing, and then therefore the market forces come and bring down the cost for everyone. So in 2019, we convened a climate insurance working group for the first time of its kind to really explore risk transfer approaches to reduce the risk to climate impacts. The working group really recognizes that our top priority must be expanding protection for our most vulnerable communities against climate threats, wildfires, extreme heat, and flooding. And we have major protection gaps, meaning that when a disaster happens, a lot of the damage is not going to be covered by insurance. Right now, as climate-intensified events are happening, wealthier people have been able to rebuild quickly after a disaster. For everyone else, it's meant paying for the cost, many out of their own pockets to rebuild, or taxpayers bearing the cost of recovery, or recovery takes a lot longer. So we need to shift how we think about insurance so that the most vulnerable people can avoid the worst impacts of disasters and recover as quickly as possible. This past year, again, we sponsored legislation to create, like I said earlier, a heat ranking system, first of its kind in the United States, which will help provide advance notice to communities so that they can prepare for the upcoming heat events and not just treat it as another weather story on the news channel. The legislation also requires the Department of Insurance to prepare a study analyzing uninsured versus insured costs associated with heat events and the insurance gap that exists among racial, socioeconomic groups that face disproportionate impacts from extreme heat. And we will be identifying insurance options to help communities adapt, prepare, and become more resilient to extreme heat events in order to close, again, the protection gap. And so this next slide is really just, I put it up there to emphasize some of the many partnerships that we forged to do this work. And we are working with a variety of partners, again, to support community resilience, to build capacity and knowledge, to improve financial oversight, and to pioneer innovation, which I think is the most exciting part of our job. And so we're cooperating again with regulators from around the world and work with the UN to give us an opportunity as state regulators to develop roadmaps in other jurisdictions. And so just again, in closing, I just want to recognize that we need progress on all of these actions, not some, but all, and all simultaneously. And community insurance, sustainable investment, TCFD, scenario analysis, and nature-positive strategies, this is part of our comprehensive vision. And the most important long-term resilience is to drastically reduce our carbon dioxide and superpollutant emissions. We recognize that, and closing the protection gap obviously is an urgent climate imperative that will help impact the equity in communities around the world. So again, thank you for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure to introduce you to our roadmap and some of the work that we're doing to, again, close the protection gap and really rethink how we're using insurance in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. That is an incredibly comprehensive roadmap. Coming from the industry perspective, Maura, could you tell us what do you think of such a roadmap? And then also, please share with us the priorities for the Canadian PSI task force.
Sure. So I'll answer your first question here, and then I'll go up and show you the same way as Commissioner Lara did. So because both the California as a regulator and the Canadian PSI members are working from the same framework, from the US framework, there's a huge degree of alignment. In fact, I'm going to be slightly embarrassed by using exactly the same words with you, things that are on my slide that might be the same. I think there's a high degree of alignment, and we're definitely inspired by the work that's coming out of California, and shamelessly review and repurpose some of your concepts. So I hope you I hope you take that as a compliment. I'm a little bit shorter than you. So I'm happy to talk to you about another approach to roadmaps or prioritization, coordinated action, and this time from an industry perspective. So PSI Canada came out of the Canadian experience in the UN PSI pilots. My colleague Huma talked a little bit about that earlier. We had a lot of positive experiences with the pilots, but we also found that it was difficult to get across the Canadian perspectives, and we found that by talking together in advance of talking to the broader international audience, we were able to be more impactful, and we understood better the approaches that we were taking. So we found that it was important to have some element of coordination. And we also had the very explicit encouragement of the UN to work together to raise our effectiveness and our ambition in Canada. So those two factors contributed to setting up this work group. So the group started out looking at the work done with the Canadian government, different policy approaches, UN associations, and we determined 4 areas where we felt we needed greater understanding and potentially action. So these 4 areas are obviously not every area that the different members are working in, but these are the 4 areas where we thought we had gaps in our understanding, gaps in action happening in Canada or internationally, so we decided to focus on those. This review was supported by the UN regional staff and assessed the aspects of the insurer's role, as Liesl said, in the 3 areas, our role as risk managers, insurers, and investors. And it was important to incorporate all 3 aspects because previously work really did focus on investment, and we needed to move forward in other areas of our operations. So the 4 areas we decided to focus on: data, lots of data. We're insurance companies. We have too much data. I see people laughing in the audience. You understand. But how do we find data, or how do we change data to make it useful for us in our operational and our strategic decisions and in our disclosures? So we worked together in this particular aspect. It was more of understanding the landscape of data and sharing approaches, sharing different ways of understanding. So definitely capacity building in order to do better, all of us, in our approach to data. Next one we worked on is net zero underwriting. And you'll note that we don't have Canadian insurers involved in the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. There are different aspects to net zero in Canada. We wanted to explore together as a group what that meant for Canada. Many of us have separate net zero commitments. We wanted to be able to contribute effectively to consultations that were going on. So a lot of this, with the help of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance coming and providing a webinar for us, with individual members stepping up to provide education and concepts. We've had a number of sessions to expand our ability to excel in this area and to participate as individual insurers and as an industry. The next one is the social thematic, and a lot of what has been said this afternoon resonates with the work that we're doing there, certainly the panel and Commissioner Lara's comments. I'll touch on that with a separate slide a little later, but we decided that in Canada we thought there wasn't enough going on in terms of products and services that had a social element, and we felt that there were barriers to those. So we decided to develop a social thematic to understand what those barriers are, and if we can, figure out a way to move forward together so that all of us can provide these types of products and services. But I'll touch on that one a bit more later, and I'll be copying a lot of Commissioner Lara's words there. And then the last area that we focused on was sustainable infrastructure. This was an area we all felt we were passionate about and it felt were very important. But actually, as we started to do a landscape review of what was happening with different actors and educated ourselves further about what was happening in this area, we found out that actually there were lots of people doing work. We hadn't known about it, we now do. And we're continuing to monitor what's going there. But if other people are doing work, there's no need for the PSI Canada group to set up something independent. So this became more about educating ourselves, and when we found that it was well in path, we moved on to look at other areas. Oops. So I have a slide here of current members of the PSI Canada group. We are very open to having other PSI Canada or North America members join our group and work together. This is the group at the moment. I hope that we get more friends join us, because the more contributing to the conversation, the better we will be as a group. So I mentioned part of what we are doing is education. As we started this work, this prioritization, this education work, what we found was that as a group working together, we were actually building capacity in the industry and capacity in individual companies. There is so much coming out. You've already been inundated with acronyms today. I could be overwhelmed by the work that's happening in California, but I know I have PSI colleagues who are working together with me to understand and assimilate the changes that are happening, to talk them through together, and we can do so much more collectively than we could as individual companies. There is a place for competition. There is a huge place for collaboration, for working together to understand, prioritize, and better influence, and this increased capacity in the industry to do more and to do better and to do it faster. We've heard that message today. That's really been the strength of this group. Did I go too far? No. There we are. So I mentioned the social thematic, and that we felt that certainly in Canada, this was an empty space. And here I think I'm repeating your words, Commissioner Lara. We needed to address the issues why socially focused products and services aren't happening at scale despite industry interest. And the specific interest we needed to address is the existing social inequalities, which mean that not everyone has the resources to adapt and to be resilient. So that is the problem statement that this group addressed. I'll end up with a sneak peek at the social framework and the social research, which we're preparing to release with the UN later on this spring with a webinar. The work is foundational to get a better understanding of the underserved or unserved market, and it's got a threefold approach. We're looking at exposures to risk, adaptive capacity, which could be different for different aspects of risk, sensitivity, referring to the degree of potential harm, and looking at the blue box at the bottom there, I want to stress the imperative that we wanted to avoid a mindset of arrogance, that we know all the solutions. Unless we do this right, we could potentially only partially be effective, or worse yet, come up with solutions or approaches that actually do harm. So I hope I've sparked your interest in some of the opportunities of collective industry collaboration and approaches. And as I said, we're definitely interested and having more PSI companies join us on this journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maura. So, I mean, working together is clearly brings benefits for everyone to be learning jointly and sharing knowledge as we learn. So I wonder, Commissioner Lara, what has been the response of the insurance industry in California, and really what are the benefits of having a sustainable insurance roadmap, both for the insurance industry, for the regulator, and of course, most importantly, for those who are insured, for clients?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. You know, we've engaged the industry since the inception of our roadmap, and we work with them on the regulations specifically around wildfire, and prove that we can actually have a meaningful dialogue with the industry, because they're also looking for guidance from the regulator. As we talk about how do we get folks to buy into this, whether, you know, as a regulator, I have the stick, right? But at the end of the day, if we don't have these collaborative discussions, nothing's gonna be insurable by the standards, right? And how do also, the other hat I wear is, as a regulator, maintaining that we have a really thriving insurance market in California. And so, but the sole source cannot just be raising rates. It has to also come with, what do the consumers get for that? And how do we incentivize better behavior for communities and residents? And that's where I think we're able to really find that balance with the roadmap. And the roadmap also provides just clear direction for the perils that we need to focus on as quickly as possible. So it brings some sort of peace of mind to Californians that we're looking at these issues, and that we're changing the way we think about insurance, right? Many people wait and, you know, just wait until the catastrophe happens, and hopefully I'm covered enough to be able to get a payout to be able to rebuild. But this is also putting on its head the way that we think about it, and maybe using insurance as a way to help us mitigate for these problems, and actually be part of the solution before this happens. And that's what we want to do. We want to engage the industry in being leaders and helping us fund and risk and transfer the risk for the mitigation part, which is key as we continue to address this ever-changing climate of ours.
Can I ask the commissioner a question? Does that mean an insurance product has to change or should change so that it is reducing risk as well as paying out?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where I get excited, is on you know, at night I'm waking up thinking, what insurance products are we gonna need for the future? And how creative can we be around parametric insurance products, community-based insurance, climate insurance? What does that look like? And so the roadmap helps us identify what those needs are going to be, and also be flexible enough to work with industry to figure out what kind of financing mechanisms and schemes are we going to need to make sure that the insurance company is successful, that we're able to pay out these claims, but that we're also working on the mitigation, and why these demonstration projects for us this coming year are going to be paramount, because we're going to tackle the specific climate threat, but we're going to be flexible around what kind of funding or financing scheme we're going to need with the insurance company. And we also know that this is going to be heavily subsidized in the beginning, just as we did in California with the solar market, right? And so we're okay with that, understanding that we have a trajectory to figure out how we scale these up. But again, it definitely is part of innovating around what products are we going to need, and how are we looking at the risk, because we can no longer price risk in a historical perspective, because everything is changing, right? So now we're looking at how do we use forecasting models, how do we use that different scenario analysis to look at what these products are going to look like. And that's what really is the exciting part for me as commissioner in California.
Any more questions?
No, I'm good. I'm good for the moment.
Commissioner Lara, I mean, since regulation in the US is state level, although California is at the front line of many perils, other states are, of course, also very affected. So what would it take for other states to have their sustainable insurance roadmaps, or do you need a national sustainable insurance roadmap for the US?
Yeah, I think the problem with the National Sustainable Insurance Program is that it won't be effective because it's not going to be enforceable since the states, regulate insurance. And I think you're seeing several states now starting to take this serious because, as we always say, flood doesn't respect state lines. It doesn't respect political boundaries, right? Neither does earthquakes or wildfire. And so the perils themselves are bringing people to the table, unfortunately. And we're starting to see states now look at, okay, what is the outcome going to be of the final set of this roadmap, and to look at ways to be able to replicate that in other states. And so I think, if anything, is an indicator of us coming together. When I first started 4 years ago as insurance commissioner, we had to change the name of our climate change committee because some commissioners wouldn't participate because it said climate change. And so I'm like, fine, call it what you want to call it, but as long as we get the work done. And some of them just were, again, because some of them are appointed by their governor, so the governor really dictates their participation. So we changed it to, sustainability, and that was a word that was kind of just more easy for them, and that was fine. But now with the TCFD disclosure, for example, that is a way we've done this in a way that's bipartisan, and in a way that we understand that we need data. At the end of the day, we need this data, we need these disclosures to figure out what's our vulnerability and also how are we going to move forward. So if anything, we're proving at the NAIC that we can actually remove politics out of climate and really get to working with the industry on these climate disclosures. And so that's a big win for us.
Thank you. So, Maura, of course, Canada's got a very different market and different perils, to some extent. So what do you see, what inspired Canadian insurance industry to get going with the action plan? Was it the insurance product development, the fact that risks just, you could see them growing? What led to that?
It was probably actually the public policy development that was happening at the time. I think this was around 2018, 2019 when the expert panel was going. And as individual companies and also as industry associations, we were talking with the panel members. I think Barb talked about that in the plenary. You will find in the final version of that report, which is an excellent report at giving the whole gambit of all of the issues, there's very little about insurance. We were not effective in putting forward our narrative, our risks, our solutions into that report to the degree that we could and should have been. And so this is about bringing across, because we have separate associations for P&C and life and also distribution models. Not everybody was members of all of those associations. This was about bridging across the two different lines of insurance so that we were able to come forward with more powerful messages, educating ourselves across those lines because we didn't realize that some of the issues cross both sides, and being more effective at the public policy level. Part of that also meant educating ourselves collectively to be effective. So coming into the work on that prioritization or that roadmap, what we were looking at were aspects that we wished were in that expert report and helping to move that narrative forward. So that's a rather long answer to that question.
Thank you. So how would you say then that the action plan contributes to the work of the expert panel or the recommendations of the expert panel for the sustainable economy and other relevant initiatives in Canada? I think there's recently another roadmap which has come from the not-for-profit sector.
So we explicitly took the expert panel work as our base and built out from that. And what I would say is we are able to use the work of this group, even the awareness of all of the consultations. With due respect to the regulator in the room, there is a lot of work going on. It is overwhelming, even knowing what consultations are going on. And now when I look at net zero as well, There's just so much going on. How does it interrelate? What's the timing? Who's coming out with something next? How are you going to prioritize work within your own organization? So the conversations that we're able to have around the table help with an understanding of where the public policy environment is going. Sometimes it's also a little bit of personal therapy because sometimes it really is overwhelming, the workload. But together to pick out areas where we can have effective common voices allows us to get that insurance narrative into the public policy sphere where it has been absent to the extent it needed to be.
Thank you. So we're nearly out of time. So final question. Could you tell us, Commissioner Lara, what are the next steps for the California roadmap and implementing it?
Thank you. And just to dovetail quickly with what Moira said, this is why it's important that that the roadmaps that are created are aligned with all these different, mandates and protocols and accords, because then it becomes much more confusing, right? So ours does, I'm proud to say. And I think what the future holds for our roadmap is actually expanding our roadmap to look at biodiversity, and in particular in California to look at plastic waste.
And for Moira, what are the next steps for Canada's insurers?
So our next steps start tomorrow, where we're doing a deep dive into a couple of the areas we've already been working on and looking at our 4 areas of prioritization and beginning the discussion of, do we need to refine these? Do we need to augment them? How are we going to approach issues going forward? The other next step is, I do wish we had more friends around the table, and I do wish that I had more friends from the U.S.
Working on it.
So it's an open invitation if there's anyone who would like to talk to Canadian PSI members about the PSI framework and the approaches that we're doing and the different work streams within PSI that could be a benefit to your companies. I would like more people at the table. We can be more effective and we can do more.
So your phone number. So if anyone has any questions, we have about 30 seconds, so please make it quick. Thank you. And say your name and your organization first, thanks.
Hi, Sherry Wilbanks with AXA and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. So Moira talked a lot about the collaboration that's been able to occur under the PSI umbrella and the work of those insurers working together. I want to put that back to Commissioner Laura and say, when you hear that and the benefits that they've seen from having that kind of collaboration, is that something you would look favorably on if U.S. insurers wanted to collaborate together on something similar?
Absolutely. And those are, I use Moira as an example all the time in the U.S. of industry leading those discussions and really working actively to get more members of the U.S. Insurers to be part of PSI, because it's going to take both of us working collaboratively. And you're seeing two approaches, but again, we're speaking the same language, which is important.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Moira, and Commissioner Lara. Fantastic conversation. And thank you.
Pleasure.